I spent my entire life providing for my daughter. Last week, she told me to shut up at her dinner table. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just picked up my keys, and by the next morning, everything she thought was hers was gone.
Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day.
I never thought the man who built this family would one day be told to keep quiet in his own home. But that night, it happened. My daughter looked me dead in the eye and said, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." For a moment, I just froze. My fork hovered in midair. The sound of clinking silverware and quiet laughter filled the room, but inside me, it was silent. My heart cracked in a way no hammer or fall ever could. I stared down at my plate, and all I could think about were the years, the decades I'd spent breaking my back for her. That night, I made a decision. But before I tell you what I did next, do me a favor, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people like me can share their stories. From the day I became a father, my whole world revolved around one promise. My daughter will never suffer the way I did. I came from nothing. Dirt floors, secondhand shoes, nights that ended with hunger gnawing at my stomach. So when I held her for the first time, I whispered a vow into that tiny ear. You will never go without, not while I still have breath in my body. And I meant it. I worked every job I could find, construction by day, fixing broken engines by night, hauling bricks on weekends. My hands were blistered, my back permanently bent, but every ache was a badge of love. Because when I walked through the door and saw her little face light up, those wide eyes, that giggle, I felt like the richest man alive. I still remember the first time she walked. She wobbled across the living room, fell straight into my arms, and I swear that moment was worth more than any paycheck I'd ever earned. I had nothing in my wallet, but everything that mattered was right there in my arms. When school started, I made sure she never felt the kind of shame I once knew. I paid every fee, bought every book, made sure she never missed a class trip. If it meant skipping dinner so she could have lunch money, I did it with a smile. I'd sip tea alone at night, hungry but proud, knowing she was asleep with a full stomach. That's what fathers do, right? We trade comfort for their future. Then came college. Her dream. My challenge. I sold my old car, the one I'd planned to restore for my retirement years. I took out loans, picked up every extra shift I could. There were nights I came home so tired I'd sit on the porch and fall asleep before I made it inside. But when I watched her walk across that stage in her graduation gown, diploma in hand, I wept. I wasn't tired, I was fulfilled. I'd done it. I kept my promise. Her wedding was the next milestone. She looked radiant walking down that aisle, just like her mother had years ago. I lost my wife long before that day, but standing there, it felt like she was beside me again, smiling, proud of the family we built. I paid for everything. The flowers, the reception, even the table linens. People said I was being foolish. You've done enough, they told me. But how could I stop? She was my little girl. Her happiness was my responsibility, even if it emptied my savings. After the wedding, when she and her husband wanted to buy a home, I didn't hesitate. I co-signed the loan, covered the down payment, and helped them move in. Every corner of that house had my fingerprints on it. From the paint I helped roll onto the walls to the porch light I installed myself. I thought this place will always have a seat for me. And oh, the dinners. To me, family dinners were sacred. They weren't just about food, they were about connection. When my wife was alive, every Sunday smelled like her cooking. We'd laugh, argue, tell stories until the candles burned down to wax puddles. After she passed, I tried to keep that tradition alive. I wanted my daughter and her kids to feel that same warmth. Every time she invited me over, I'd shave, put on my best shirt, shine my old shoes, and bring little gifts for the grandkids, a book here, a bag of candy there. They'd sit around me while I told them stories about the old days, about their grandmother's laughter, about the life that came before theirs. I wanted them to know me. To know where they came from. Those moments made me feel like I still mattered. Like I wasn't just an old man waiting to fade away. I'd look around that table, my blood, my family, and think, this is what all the years of sacrifice were for. This is my legacy. So when that night came, when my daughter told me to shut up at that very same table, it didn't just hurt. It shattered something deep inside me. Because those dinners were never just routine for me. They were sacred. They were the last piece of belonging I had left. My wife was gone. My friends were gone. My body wasn't what it used to be. But when I sat at that table telling stories to my grandkids, I felt alive again. And I truly believed, naively maybe, that my daughter understood that. That she valued it too. I never imagined she'd see my voice as noise. That my stories would become a nuisance. I thought I was giving her children something priceless, memory, history, love. A connection to the roots that made them who they are. I thought she saw me as the man who built this family. But that night I realized I was wrong. That night when my daughter told me to shut up, something inside me shattered quietly. It was like watching the last bridge between us burn while I stood on the edge, powerless to stop it. That's when I finally saw the truth. To her, I wasn't the man who built her future anymore. I wasn't the father who carried her on his shoulders or the one who gave up sleep so she could dream big. No, I had become something smaller. An old man taking up space at her table. And the saddest part? Didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I could have seen it coming, maybe I could have prepared my heart. But it came in pieces. Little cuts that didn't bleed at first, but over time they drained me. First, it was just her tone. A sigh. A small eye roll when I repeated a story. I brushed it off. I told myself she's tired. She has kids. She's juggling bills, a husband, a life. I didn't want to take it personally. But those little signs? They grew sharper. One evening, I started talking about her mother, about the way she used to hum while cooking, and my daughter cut me off mid-sentence. "Dad, we've heard this already," she said. That was all. Just 6 words. But they hit harder than any insult. My wife's memory wasn't just a story to me. It was a heartbeat I was trying to keep alive. Till I forced a smile and swallowed it down. "She's stressed," I told myself again. "Don't make a fuss." The hardest part came when the grandchildren started to copy her. Kids pick up everything, even the things you wish they wouldn't. When I began speaking, I'd catch them glancing toward their mother, waiting to see if my words were worth listening to. Sometimes they'd giggle and roll their eyes the same way she did. They weren't cruel. They were just learning. But every time it happened, I felt myself shrinking a little more. The stories that once made them laugh now felt like noise no one wanted to hear. Got worse. If I asked how her day was, she'd sigh, "Dad, I don't have time for this." If I gave a small piece of advice about the kids, something innocent like how to help with homework, she'd snap back, "We know how to raise our children." "Thanks." I'd nod quietly, pretending it didn't sting. I kept my lips pressed shut so the ache in my chest wouldn't spill out. Because I believed daughters loved their fathers, no matter what. But deep down, I started to feel it, that painful truth you don't want to say out loud. The distance wasn't temporary. It was growing. I remember one night after dinner. We were sitting in the living room, and I started telling the grandkids about how their grandmother used to sew their mom's dresses by hand. I thought they'd like that, to know how strong, how clever she was. Halfway through my story, my daughter clapped her hands and said, "Okay, kids, bedtime. Grandpa's boring stories can wait." She laughed. Maybe she thought it was harmless. But I saw the way the kids smirked, how they glanced at me like I was the punchline before running upstairs. I just sat there on the couch, the rest of my story stuck in my throat. When I finally left, I sat in my car in the dark and cried quietly before driving home. Another time, I brought a photo album. I'd spent hours putting it together, pictures from her childhood, her mother's smile, old family trips. I thought it would be a gift. A bridge between generations. After dinner, I placed it on the table. "I brought something special," I said. She glanced at it, sighed, and said, "Dad, we don't need old pictures lying around. Please don't clutter the house with this." She pushed the album aside. And something in me folded. Those weren't just photos. That was our life. But to her, it was clutter. Even her husband started joining in. He used to be polite, even kind. But somewhere along the way, he followed her lead. If I spoke too long, I'd catch him exchanging looks with her, a smirk that said, "Here he goes again." Once, I forgot the name of an old friend mid-story, and he chuckled, "Losing it, huh?" She laughed with him. I pretended I didn't hear. But I did. Still, I told myself to endure it. I remembered the nights I stayed up holding her hand through a fever. The mornings I walked miles to work so she could have bus fare. The way she used to run into my arms shouting, "I missed you, Dad." How could I let go of all that love just because she'd grown distant? No, I told myself. Families go through seasons. This was just a cold one. She'd come around. She had to. But as the months passed, the warmth never came back. The air between us turned to ice. She stopped calling unless she needed something. She stopped asking how I was. Even when my health started showing its age, she barely noticed. And at the dinner table, the place that used to be my sanctuary, I became the silence everyone ignored. My voice didn't light up the room anymore, it dimmed it. I smiled through their mockery. I stayed quiet through their sighs. I told myself she's tired. She doesn't mean it. But the truth was sitting right there across from me every night. In her eyes, I wasn't her father anymore. I was just an old man who had outlived his usefulness. And then came that final night. The night she told me to shut up. That night, all those small cuts bled at once. The dinner was supposed to be simple, family, food, laughter. The kind of evening that once made me proud to be alive. Table was set beautifully, the kids in their usual spots. I sat near the end, back straight, hands folded, ready to belong, ready to be part of my own family. 'Cause to me, those dinners weren't routine. They were sacred. They were the heartbeat of what little family I had left. But that night, that heartbeat stopped. And everything changed. That night, I showed up wearing my best shirt, freshly pressed, collar crisp, shoes polished until they caught the light. Even at my age, I believed in showing respect. I wanted them to see that I was present, not as some quiet shadow in the corner, but as their father, their grandfather, the man whose hands had built the life they were now living. The table looked beautiful. Plates filled, glasses clinking, bits of laughter bouncing from one end to the other. I smiled quietly, letting the warmth of family chatter wash over me. The children were telling stories about school, about their games, about friends I'd never met but felt like I knew from how often they spoke of them. And for a while, I felt at peace. These moments were why I kept going, why I never gave up, no matter how tired or lonely the nights became. Then there was a pause, a small lull between the laughter and the next conversation. I thought, this is the right moment. There was something I'd been wanting to share all day, a story about my late wife, their grandmother. I wanted the children to know her, to feel her love through my words. So I cleared my throat softly and began, when your grandmother was your age, she used to. But before I could finish, I saw my daughter stiffen. Her eyes sharpened. Her mouth pressed into that familiar thin line I'd come to dread. And then, before I could take another breath, her voice sliced through the air. Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares. The sound hit me like a blow. The laughter died instantly. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Surely, I told myself, she couldn't have said that, not here, not in front of her children, not to me. But she had. And worse, her husband laughed. He didn't defend me. He didn't say, come on, that's too much. He just chuckled, soft, careless, cruel, as if my humiliation were a private joke between them. That laughter, it broke something. The air grew thick with silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it swallows it. The grandchildren froze, their eyes glued to their plates. The youngest twisted his spoon nervously, cheeks red with confusion. The oldest reached for his glass, pretending to sip water, though I saw his hand tremble. No one looked at me. No one said a word. And I understood. They were learning in that moment how to treat me, learning it from the same woman I had once carried on my shoulders. Inside, my chest burned. 1,000 memories flooded back. The nights I'd worked through pain just to pay for her books, the mornings I'd gone hungry so she could eat, the years I'd given her everything I had and then some. I wanted to stand up and remind her who I was. To shout, I am the reason this table exists. But my voice didn't rise. My pride did. Instead, I set my fork down gently, lowered my eyes, and stayed quiet. I let her words win because I realized something deeper than the insult itself. She didn't say it out of anger. She said it because she believed it. To her, I truly was nobody worth listening to. The conversation moved on without me. Slowly at first, then like nothing had happened. Plates passed, jokes resumed, laughter returned. The room was alive again, except for me. I sat there in silence like a ghost among the living. My ears heard the laughter, but it felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. She had done more than silence me. She'd erased me. Right there, at the very table I had built with my own hands, I ceased to exist. I thought of my wife, how she would have wept to see this. I thought of the love I had poured into raising a daughter who now looked at me like I was an inconvenience. And I thought of how small I must have looked to my grandchildren, sitting there with my shoulders heavy, pretending not to notice, pretending it didn't hurt. When the plates were cleared and the night finally ended, I pushed back my chair slowly. My hands trembled as I reached for my coat. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. No one even noticed. To them, it was just another dinner. But to me, it was the night I realized I didn't belong anymore. Not as a father. Not as a storyteller. Not even as a man who once mattered. And that realization, more than her words, more than the laughter, hollowed me out completely. Because once a man loses his place at his own family's table, there's no chair left in the world that feels like home. For years, I had carried their comfort on my shoulders. I made sure their lights stayed on, their bills got paid, their home stayed steady even when life got rough. Whenever something broke, I fixed it. Whenever money ran short, I filled the gap, quietly, without complaint. That was what fathers did. And yet there he was, my son-in-law, sitting across from me, smirking while my daughter's words gutted me. Enjoying the show as she cut me down. I lowered my head. My instincts screamed to speak, to stand up and remind them who I was, the man who had built this family with his hands, his sweat, his years. But I didn't. 'Cause I knew that if I opened my mouth, my voice would shake. My anger would spill out like blood. And they'd all look at me the same way they always did, like a tired old man throwing a tantrum. So I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, but because silence was the only dignity I had left. My calm face was the last shield I could hold. But inside, I was crumbling. Memories began to flash through my mind, bright and cruel in their contrast to that cold room. I saw her as a little girl again, her legs too tired to walk home from school, and me, younger, stronger, carrying her on my shoulders while she giggled in my ear. I remembered the nights I worked until dawn so she could have a new dress for her school dance, the one she had cried over because we couldn't afford it. I remembered her wedding day, standing tall with pride as she walked into a life I had helped make possible. And now, decades later, I sat at her table, silenced like a stranger who had wandered in from the street. I tried to eat. I really did. But the food turned to ash the moment it touched my tongue. Every bite felt heavy, tasteless, impossible to swallow. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted my fork, but I forced myself to chew slowly, pretending nothing was wrong. Pretending I didn't notice the way they laughed when I forgot things, the way she rolled her eyes, the way he smirked. Pretending she still loved me the way I loved her. But that night, there was no pretending left. The words had been too sharp, too public, too real. I looked around that table one last time. My grandchildren stiff and silent. Her husband sipping from his glass with that smug little grin. My daughter composed, satisfied, as if she hadn't just destroyed something sacred. She moved the conversation forward, cheerful, unbothered. And me, sitting there, shrinking quietly inside myself, my heart breaking in a way no one could see. The worst part wasn't her voice. It was the silence that followed. No one said a word. No one said, "That's enough." No one changed the subject to save me from the humiliation. The silence was their answer. It was their agreement. It was their approval. That silence told me exactly where I stood in that family. Nowhere. I swallowed the last bite on my plate, though it burned going down. I set my fork down gently, folded my napkin with care, and kept my face still. No pain. No anger. No disappointment. Just calm. Because I realized then, if they could humiliate me so easily, it meant I had stopped being family to them long ago. The meal ended. Chairs scraped the floor. Dishes clattered in the sink. The house moved on, laughter filling the kitchen again. But I sat frozen in my chair, my body still there while my spirit had already left. That night I knew this was the last dinner I would ever attend in that house. Not because I wasn't welcome, but because I would never allow myself to be broken like that again. When I finally stood, I did it slowly, steady, deliberate, controlled. I didn't slam the chair or make a scene. I didn't demand an apology or shout for respect. I just walked away. Quietly. Calmly. Holding my pride like a fragile piece of glass in my chest. They might have thought my silence was weakness. But I knew better. It was the first moment of strength I'd had in years. It was the beginning of the end of my silence. When I got to my car, I didn't drive right away. I sat there in their driveway, the steering wheel cold beneath my hands. Through the windshield, I could see the faint glow of the kitchen window, my daughter moving around inside with her husband, laughing softly as they cleaned up. From that distance, they looked like a picture of a perfect family, warm, whole, content. And me? I was parked outside, watching through the glass like a stranger. My own bloodline, and I was on the outside looking in. Her words replayed in my head on a loop. "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." For words. For words that stripped away years of excuses I'd built to protect my heart. For so long, I'd convinced myself that her harshness was just stress. That her cold tone didn't mean she stopped caring. That the daughter I raised was still somewhere inside her. But those 4 words ended the illusion. Because if she could say that to me, in front of her children, her husband, our entire family, then it wasn't a slip. It was the truth she believed. She didn't just want me quiet. She wanted me gone. Invisible. Forgotten. And sitting there in the dark, hands trembling on the wheel, I felt 2 things at once, heartbreak and resolve. Because in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was the turning point. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had reduced me to nothing. But what they didn't realize was that in trying to destroy my voice, they gave me back my strength to finally walk away. I sat there in the dark with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, letting the memories wash over me like waves I couldn't stop. I remembered the nights I went to bed hungry so she could eat. The winters I spent working double shifts in freezing air, my fingers numb just so her feet would stay warm in new boots. I remembered paying her hospital bills, hiding the fear in my eyes so she'd never see me worry. Staying up late helping her with homework when my own eyelids felt like lead. Tears of pride that fell when she walked across that graduation stage. The joy that filled my chest when I walked her down the aisle, standing taller than my aching back should have allowed. All those sacrifices. All those years. Every moment I thought had built a foundation of love and respect. They all collapsed under the weight of one sentence. "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." I thought of her mother, my late wife. I could almost hear her voice in my head, gentle but firm, the way she used to step in whenever anyone tried to belittle me. If she had been alive, she never would have let our daughter speak to me that way. She would have stopped the insult before it left her lips. For the first time in years, I missed her with a pain so sharp it stole my breath. Sitting there alone in the driveway, I wished I could turn to her and ask, "What did I do wrong? Where did we lose her?" But there was no answer. Only silence. I sat there for nearly an hour, not just replaying the insult but rethinking my entire place in their lives. And in that stillness, I realized something that hurt more than the humiliation itself. I wasn't a father anymore. Not to her. In her eyes, I wasn't the man who had provided, protected, and built her life brick by brick. I wasn't the steady hand that carried her through childhood. I had become an inconvenience, a voice too old, a story too long, a presence too easy to ignore. I was no longer family. Just a guest she tolerated until I spoke too much. That truth broke something inside me that no apology could ever fix. Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them away. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, whispering prayers into the still night. I asked for strength, for understanding, for the courage to do what I knew had to be done. Because in that cold driveway, one truth became painfully clear. Love does not mean allowing yourself to be humiliated. Sacrifice does not mean surrendering your dignity. And silence, though it had protected me that night, could no longer be my only defense. I thought about everything I'd given. The years, the money, the labor, the missed dreams. I had poured my life into making sure my daughter never knew hardship. And what did it buy me? A seat at a table where my words were unwelcome. A place in a home where my presence was mocked. A life where I had become invisible, in the very house I helped build. As the night air grew colder, I made my decision. Quietly. Without rage. Without tears. This would be the last time. The last insult. The last dinner. The last time I let anyone, especially my own blood, make me feel small. There would be no next time, no second chances, no wishful waiting for softer words that would never come. This was the line. And once I crossed it, I wasn't going back. When I finally turned the key, the engine hummed to life. But I didn't drive home heavy with shame. I drove with something different, a strange calm. It was as if the very humiliation that had burned through me had also cleared my vision. For the first time in years, I saw myself clearly in the rearview mirror, not as a broken old man, but as someone who had finally found his voice. When I parked in my own driveway, I didn't rush to get out. I sat there one last time in silence, but it wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. It was the silence of resolve. I whispered one word into the dark. Enough. And in that moment, I knew, the next time my daughter saw me, she wouldn't be looking at the man she thought she could silence. She'd be looking at the man who finally remembered his worth. When I woke up the next morning, her voice was still echoing in my head, sharp, cruel, final. Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares. But this time, it didn't sting the way it had the night before. The pain was still there, yes, but underneath it was something new. Power. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. Stronger. A steady awareness that I was not as powerless as she believed. My daughter thought time had stripped me of authority, that old age had made me small, dependent, voiceless. She saw an aging man clinging to stories of the past, too fragile to matter anymore. But the truth was written in ink. In signatures. In papers she'd forgotten existed. The truth lived in drawers, in safes, in old filing cabinets, proof that the world she stood on was still built on my foundation. She had no idea how much of her comfort, her security, her very home still carried my name. I sat at the small kitchen table in my modest house, the morning light spilling across the worn wood. In front of me sat a stack of folders, deeds, bank statements, titles, contracts, the quiet records of a lifetime's work. Each page was a reminder I had built more than walls and roofs. I had built her life. I traced my fingers over the documents, the mortgage I'd co-signed, the land title still bound to my signature, the car registration that listed me as owner. Even the family fund that kept their lights on when bills ran too high was drawn from my pension, my savings, the years I'd spent saying yes every time she asked. And yet, last night, she'd looked at me like I was disposable. I almost laughed, not out of joy but disbelief. Because the man she had told to shut up was the same man who still held the strings she didn't even realize were in his hands. The car she drove? Registered in my name. The house she lived in? Still standing on land legally tied to mine. The family account she dipped into for every emergency? Fueled by money I'd worked decades to earn. She thought time had erased my presence from her life. But time doesn't erase truth. My name was still everywhere, written beneath hers, quietly holding everything up. I picked up my old car keys, the ones I'd slipped into my pocket the night before, almost without thinking. I turned them over slowly in my palm, feeling the weight of the metal, the familiar ridges against my skin. They weren't just keys. They were symbols. Of ownership. Of authority. Control. When I took them at the table, it hadn't been a meaningless gesture. I hadn't realized it then, but that moment was me reclaiming something I'd forgotten I still had, power. Because the truth was simple. I could walk away at any time. Car could be gone with a single call. The house could change hands with a single signature. The fund could disappear quietly into a closed account. My daughter thought she'd silenced me forever at that table. But all she did was wake up a part of me that had been sleeping for too long, the part that remembered what it meant to stand tall. The will to reclaim my dignity. I thought back to the man I once was, the man my wife had fallen in love with. Strong. Grounded. Kind of man who faced storms head-on and never wavered. Somewhere along the line, I'd let that man fade. I'd mistaken silence for surrender. I confused patience with weakness. But as I stared at those papers, those signatures, those keys, I remembered who I was. I was still the patriarch. Still the builder. Still the man whose sweat, labor, and name held this family together. My silence had never been helplessness. It was discipline. It was restraint. It was power, waiting for the right moment to speak without saying a word. I didn't storm into her house. I didn't raise my voice or demand the respect I was owed. That would have been too small, too noisy, too weak. No. My answer would not come in words. It would come in quiet movements, in signatures made without warning, in accounts quietly closed, in locks that suddenly no longer turned. It would come in the still, deliberate realization that the things she believed were hers had always been mine. And when the day came that she reached for what she thought belonged to her and found it gone, she'd finally understand what my silence had always meant. Not surrender, but strength. As I slid the folders back into the drawer, a calmness settled over me, one so quiet it almost felt sacred. The storm that had raged inside me since that night had burned itself clean. What was left wasn't chaos or fury. It was focus. It was purpose. The humiliation from that dinner table hadn't destroyed me, it had forged me into something sharper. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need her recognition or apology. That part of our bond, the father and daughter I used to know, was gone, and I finally accepted that. What I needed now wasn't her respect. It was my own. Keys jingled softly in my hand, a metallic whisper of truth. They were mine, just like the house, the car, the land, the foundation beneath her comfort. She had built her arrogance on what I had built for her, and that irony made me almost smile. I slipped the keys back into my pocket, feeling their weight against my leg. And in that small, private moment, I knew exactly how this story would end. When the time came, I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't even explain. I would act. Quietly. Firmly. Finally. Because sometimes the sharpest revenge doesn't echo. It whispers. And my silence was about to speak louder than her cruelty ever had. The next evening, my little house felt heavier than usual. The air was still, almost reverent, as if it knew what was coming. The humiliation hadn't faded. It had simply hardened into something solid inside me, steady and undeniable. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the loud, reckless way that shouts and breaks things. No, this was a colder kind of anger, the kind that cuts with precision. It wasn't rage that guided me now. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I could see everything for what it really was. My daughter didn't respect me. My son-in-law didn't take me seriously. My grandchildren were learning to treat me as background noise. I wasn't part of the family anymore. I was a piece of furniture, something that filled space, not hearts. And I decided that night that I would no longer live my life as furniture in someone else's home. I sat at my dining table, a simple wooden one, scarred and stained from decades of use. Every scratch had a story. Every ring from a coffee cup carried a memory. This table had seen laughter, birthdays, loss, and love. And now it would see the moment I reclaimed myself. I laid out my choices, plain as the wood beneath my hands. I could confront her, tell her exactly how she'd hurt me. But what would that bring? A smirk from her husband, another sigh, maybe even a cruel joke. I could forgive her as I had so many times before. But forgiveness without change isn't grace, it's surrender. And I had surrendered too many times already. Or I could finally do what my heart had been whispering since I picked up those keys the night before. I could leave. Not as a warning. Not as a lesson. Not to make her feel guilty or chase after me. But to walk away fully, completely, and finally. The longer I thought about it, the lighter I felt. It wasn't bitterness, it was freedom. Leaving wasn't weakness. It was survival. It was dignity. I realized then that for years I had lived on borrowed hope. I kept believing that one day she would look at me and see her father again, the man who gave her everything he had. But hope, when it's one-sided, can be poison. It blinds you to what's right in front of you. And what was in front of me was simple. Her words, "nobody cares," weren't a mistake. They weren't stress. They weren't exhaustion. They were truth. Her truth. So I decided to make mine. And in that quiet, empty house, I whispered it aloud, steady and sure. Enough. Because the next chapter of my life would not begin with their permission. It would begin with my choice to finally walk away. I stood up from my chair, the decision already carved into my bones. I walked to the closet, opened the door, and pulled out a small suitcase. Not the big one for long trips, but the smaller one, the kind a person carries when they don't plan on coming back. Slowly, methodically, I began to pack. A few shirts. A pair of trousers. My warm coat. The framed photo of my wife from the nightstand. And the folder, the one filled with deeds, titles, bank papers, the quiet proof of my life's work. I didn't take much. I didn't need much. For the first time in decades, I was packing for myself. Not for a family vacation. Not for someone else's comfort. Just for me. As I folded my clothes, I thought about everything I was leaving behind. The house my daughter assumed would one day be hers. The fund she dipped into without so much as a thank you. The car she called hers, but that still sat under my name. All of it still mine until I chose otherwise. And I knew one thing with absolute clarity. When I left, I would begin the process of erasing her name from everything that once tied us together. The will. The accounts. The deeds. My silence at that dinner table had been the last sound she would ever get from me. But my decision now, this quiet act of walking away, would echo louder than any words. I walked through the house one last time. The walls were bare, the rooms still, yet they carried ghosts. This had been my home, built by my hands, once filled with laughter, warmth, and the soft hum of my wife's presence. Now only memories lingered. I paused in the doorway where pencil marks still measured my daughter's childhood, each little line marking the years she grew taller, stronger, more distant. My fingers brushed over the faded notches. For a moment, my hand trembled. A pang of grief cut through me, not for the house, not for the things, but for the love that had once filled it. The love that had died the night she looked me in the eye and said, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." That sentence had ended more than a conversation. It had ended a lifetime. My suitcase waited by the door. I picked up my keys, cold metal, solid, real, and held them in my palm. This time, they didn't feel like reminders of what I had given her. They felt like proof of what I still owned, what I still was. I slipped them into my pocket, straightened my back, and whispered to myself, "This is the last time. The last time I sit at her table. The last time I endure her contempt. The last time I let my silence mean defeat." I looked around one final time, not with sadness but with finality. Every picture, every piece of furniture, every faded echo of laughter now carried the stain of disappointment. Taking any of it with me would only weigh me down. I didn't need those things. All I needed was the decision I had already made. So I turned off the lights. The house sank into darkness. I locked the door behind me and stepped out into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the sky stretched wide and endless above me. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't known since my youth: freedom. Not the kind that comes from running, but the kind that comes from finally letting go. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a speech. My daughter wanted me silent. So silent I would be, but on my own terms. This silence wasn't humiliation anymore. It was liberation. It was the silence of a door closing gently but permanently. The silence of a man reclaiming his dignity. That night I drove away with no destination in mind. Just away. Away from the insults. Away from the cold eyes. Away from the table where I no longer had a seat. My decision was final. My path unshakable. I didn't look back. Not once. Because sometimes the strongest words a man can speak are none at all. I drove through the night, the road stretching out in front of me like it had been waiting all along, a quiet invitation I'd ignored for years. The headlights carved through the darkness, mile after mile, while the small suitcase sat in the passenger seat beside me. On top of it lay my wife's photograph, her calm smile glowing softly under the dashboard light. The hum of the engine filled the car, steady, rhythmic, alive. It was the only sound I needed. More comforting than all the hollow laughter and forced politeness I'd endured at my daughter's table. For the first time in years, I felt no need to justify my existence, no need to measure my words, no need to shrink just to be tolerated. I was leaving. And I wasn't coming back. By sunrise, I had crossed 2 towns. I pulled into a small roadside motel, the kind travelers barely notice, with cracked pavements, sun-bleached curtains, and a flickering neon vacancy sign buzzing like an old memory. To anyone else, it might have looked like a place to pass through. To me, it looked like freedom. The clerk barely looked up as I signed the guest book. I paid in cash, gave only my name, and carried my small suitcase up the narrow, creaking stairs. The room smelled faintly of dust and detergent, the wallpaper peeling at the corners. But it was mine. My space. My choice. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at a street I didn't recognize, and for the first time in decades, the unfamiliar didn't frighten me. Calmed me. The morning light spilled across the worn carpet, and I realized. I felt peace. Not joy. Not sadness. Just peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting for a place where you're no longer wanted. That morning, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, a man who had stood by me for years through property sales, investments, and every small detail of the life I'd built. His voice was calm, professional, familiar. "Tell me what you need," he said. And so I did. I told him I wanted my daughter's name removed from my will. I wanted her cut off from every account, every deed, every asset she assumed was already hers. I wanted the house she called home prepared for sale. I wanted my silence to finally speak for me, through ink, through law, through action. He paused for only a moment. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. I've never been more certain in my life. The days that followed moved faster than any argument could. Paper replaced conversation. Signatures replaced apologies. Deeds were transferred. Accounts were revised. Authorizations finalized. Every stroke of the pen carried the weight of my decision. My lawyer handled it all discreetly, exactly as I'd asked. And while she lived her life assuming her words had crushed me, while she laughed in her kitchen, believing her insult had silenced me, the truth was far different. My silence was working louder than her voice ever had. My silence was erasing her from everything she'd once claimed as hers. I didn't call her. I didn't send a message. I didn't explain. Because there was nothing left to explain. Night, I sat by the small hotel window, the city lights dim in the distance. The air smelled of rain and asphalt. I'd sip a cup of lukewarm coffee and watch the cars pass by, thinking about the choices I'd made. Was it harsh? Maybe. But was it fair? Absolutely. She had taken my sacrifices and turned them into expectations. She had used my devotion as a given, my love as a resource. She had humiliated me, not once but over and over, until I barely recognized the man she was speaking to. She had told me I was nothing. And now, without a word, I was showing her the truth, not through shouting, not through vengeance, but through the quiet, deliberate weight of consequence. Because the man she thought she silenced still held the power she never respected. And my silence, signed, sealed, and final, was louder than her voice could ever be. I could already picture it, the moment the truth reached her. The confusion. The disbelief. The growing panic in her voice as she realized I was gone, truly gone, and that the safety net she had always taken for granted had disappeared right along with me. I didn't imagine it with satisfaction or cruelty. I wasn't a vindictive man. But I knew it was necessary. Necessary for her to understand what I had tried to teach her my whole life. That respect is not optional. That family is not a one-way road. That a father is not a servant to be tolerated, dismissed, or mocked when his usefulness seems to fade. Each morning I made my quiet walk to the little corner cafe down the street from the hotel. The same waitress smiled and poured my coffee without asking for my name. I'd order toast and eggs, sit by the window, and watch strangers rush through their lives. To them, I was no one. Just another old man with a small suitcase and a cup of coffee, staring out at the world. But to me, that anonymity was freedom. For the first time in decades, I wasn't Dad. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a story to be interrupted or dismissed. I was simply me. And that, at last, was enough. A week later, my lawyer called. His voice was calm, professional, almost reverent. "It's done," he said. My daughter's name was gone, erased from the will, removed from every account, every deed, every future. The house had been listed, the funds secured, the assets protected. Piece by piece, she had been written out of the legacy she once believed she controlled. And with every signature, every document finalized, I felt lighter. The humiliation that had once burned in my chest was gone, replaced with something far stronger, resolve. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't demanded an apology. I hadn't sought revenge. I had simply disappeared. And in doing so, I had taken everything she thought was hers, everything she had built her arrogance upon. That night, I sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp in my small hotel room. The walls were thin, the air smelled faintly of rain, and I could hear the soft hum of traffic outside. I reached into my suitcase, pulled out the photo of my wife, and placed it gently on the nightstand. Her smile, frozen in that old photograph, seemed to look right through me. "I did what you would have wanted," I whispered. "I didn't let her break me. I didn't let her turn our sacrifices into a joke." I walked away with dignity. And in that quiet room, I could almost feel her presence, calm, steady, proud. For the first time since she'd passed, I felt like I'd finally made her proud again. The disappearance wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, complete. I wasn't just gone from their dinner table. I was gone from their future. And the silence I left behind, it was louder than any argument I could have ever made. But silence never stays quiet for long. Within days, the phone began to ring. Once or twice at first, then endlessly. My daughter's number lit up the screen again and again. But I never answered. I didn't need to. The lawyer had already carried out my instructions. By now, she would be learning the truth, not all at once, but piece by piece, like the slow unraveling of a thread she thought would never end. First, her voicemails were sharp, irritated. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny. Call me back." Then came unease. "Dad, the bank says my name isn't on the account anymore. Did you do something? We need to talk." And finally, desperation. "Please, Dad. Don't do this. I didn't mean it that way. You can't just erase me from everything. I'm your daughter." Her voice cracked in that last message, the way it used to when she was little and afraid. And I sat there in silence, listening to it fade, knowing that for the first time in her life, she finally understood what silence feels like. Her voice cracked on that word, daughter. And in that single fragile sound, I heard every ounce of irony life could hold. She remembered I was her father only when she wanted something. Only when the world stopped giving and she realized how much of it had been built on my back. The house was the one that broke her. She'd always assumed it would be hers someday. She decorated it like it already belonged to her. Hosted family dinners, posted pictures of her home online, invited guests as if I were just the caretaker. But the truth arrived the same way all truths do, quietly, through paper and ink. The listing went live. Property went up for sale. And her claim to it disappeared just like her respect had years before. The phone rang again. I didn't answer, but I listened to her message later, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. "You can't sell my house." But it had never been hers. Not legally. Not morally. It was mine, every beam, every nail, every memory buried in its walls. And I had simply decided to take back what she had forgotten to honor. Then came her husband. His voice was sharper, colder, wrapped in false authority. "You've gone too far," This is betrayal. Cruelty. You're tearing the family apart. I sat in silence, listening to his words, shaking my head. Betrayal? Cruelty? They had mocked me at my own table. They had silenced me, humiliated me in front of my grandchildren, treated me like an inconvenience in the home I helped build. And yet, the moment I stood up for myself, I was the cruel one. But I knew the truth. What I had done wasn't cruelty. It was justice. Quiet. Patient. Measured. The grandchildren never called. Maybe they were too young to understand, or maybe she didn't tell them what really happened. Maybe she painted me as the villain. Still, I thought of them often. I hoped that one day, when they were older and the world had taught them about pride, patience, and consequence, they'd look back and understand. They'd see that even the gentlest man can reach his limit. That silence has edges. And that respect, especially within a family, is never optional. My lawyer sent me updates as the weeks passed. Process was smooth. Efficient. Irreversible. He told me her panic had burned itself out, replaced by resignation. The signatures were complete. The sales finalized. Transfers sealed. There was no undoing what had been done. My silence, the very thing she'd mocked, had spoken louder than any shouted defense ever could. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed without the weight of waiting for her love, for her respect, for the smallest hint of kindness that never came. The ache was gone. The table, the house, the painful quiet, all of it behind me. I no longer waited for calls that would never come. I no longer sat where my words weren't welcome. I no longer lived half a life in the shadow of disrespect. She had told me to shut up. So I did. But my silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a door closing. It was the quiet of a man reclaiming his dignity. She had pushed me out of her world with her words. And I had closed the door behind me, not with bitterness, but with peace. Because sometimes the only way to be heard is to stop speaking altogether. In the end, the aftermath was simple. She lost everything she believed was hers. And I gained the one thing she could never give me, peace. Today I sit far from that dinner table, in a quiet cabin tucked near the mountains where the pines whisper in the wind and the rivers never stop moving. The air here is crisp, untouched by bitterness, clean in a way my heart hadn't felt in years. Each morning I wake not to voices dripping with contempt but to birdsong. I brew my coffee slowly, savoring the smell, the warmth, the stillness. Then I sit by the window and watch the sunrise spread gold across the peaks. There is no tension here, no weight pressing on my chest, no waiting for sharp words to fall like knives across the table. There is only peace. First, the silence felt strange. I had spent so many years in the noise of family, the chatter of grandchildren, the sharp tone of my daughter, the hollow laughter that had never included me. But this silence, this was different. This was not the silence of humiliation. This was the silence of dignity. Here, when I choose not to speak, it's not because I'm afraid or unwelcome. It's because I'm content. I eat my meals alone, yes, but there's pride in every bite. No one interrupts me. No one mocks me. Every mouthful tastes like freedom. Every breath feels like reclamation. I've built a quiet rhythm for my days. In the mornings, I walk the dirt paths with my cane, nodding to neighbors who don't know my story and don't need to. To them, I'm just another old man who loves the fresh mountain air, and that's enough. In the afternoons, I read the books I never had time for when I was busy providing, sacrificing, enduring. Stories that take me far from the past into worlds where peace isn't earned through pain. And at night, I sit by the fire, the photograph of my wife resting on the mantel. I speak to her sometimes softly, telling her what I've done, how I've endured, how I've chosen dignity over humiliation. And in the quiet crackle of the fire, I can almost feel her beside me, steady, approving, proud. The money from the house sale keeps me comfortable. I don't need much, just enough to live without worry, to afford my medicine, to buy small comforts. The rest, I've decided, will go where it's deserved. Not to the ungrateful. Not to the ones who turn their backs on respect. But to children who need a helping hand. To families who understand gratitude. To people who still believe that kindness matters. My legacy will not flow to cold blood, it will nourish warm hearts. Sometimes I think of my daughter. I wonder if she still sits at that same table, the one where she told me to shut up. I wonder if she hears her own words echo in her mind when she sees the empty chair where I used to sit. Does she feel regret? Does she understand what she lost? Or has she buried the shame as deeply as she buried her respect? It doesn't matter anymore. Her choices are hers. Mine are mine. I am not waiting for her apology. I am not holding open a door that was closed long ago. My story with her ended the moment I walked out. And I feel no guilt for that, because love without respect is not love. Family without dignity is not family. And silence forced upon you is humiliation. But silence chosen on your own terms, that is power. So here I stay, in my small cabin among the mountains. Living quietly. Living freely. I don't need revenge. I don't crave recognition. Peace is enough. Dignity is enough. My heart, though scarred, beats steady. My spirit, though weathered, stands unbroken. She told me to shut up. So I did. And in my silence, I took everything she thought was hers, and reclaimed everything she had forgotten I still was.
Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.